Welcome to Brother Miller's Book of Mormon Notes. Why do bad things happen to good people? And when something bad happens to someone you love, what doctrine could you teach them that would help them understand why this bad thing's happening to them and give them comfort? That's the background, I believe, of the readings that we're having this week in the Come Follow Me curriculum. In the past, Lehi's family has not quite been ideal, especially if you're young growing up in it. Imagine Laman and Lemuel as your older brothers, pulling your hair, teasing you, mocking you, berating you, demeaning you. They would not be what anyone would hope for older brothers. And Father Lehi has a chance to talk to one of his sons who's a really good kid, and tries to explain to him why bad things happen to good people and how it can turn out for his good. At the start of 2 Nephi chapter 2, Father Lehi says this, "And now, Jacob, I speak unto you, thou art my firstborn in the days of my tribulation in the wilderness." And I always start to try and think, holy cow, how would it have been to have been dad and leading this little group out of Jerusalem through the wilderness, suffering what they've suffered, having the fracture in the family, which is probably even more of an issue for him than it would be the suffering of being tired or hungry or cold or too hot. The days of my tribulation in the wilderness. And behold, in thy childhood thou hast suffered afflictions and much sorrow, because of the rudeness of thy brethren. He doesn't bring up, because you were really hot, you had to ride, or you were in the heat, or remember the time when you fell off and got hurt. Whatever it is, it's because of your brothers. And probably chapter 2, verse 2 is one of my all-time favorite verses in all of Book of Mormon. "Nevertheless, Jacob, my firstborn in the wilderness, thou knowest the greatness of God, and he shall consecrate thy afflictions for thy gain." I am convinced if we can tie those who are good people and bad things happen to them, tie them to God, the goodness of God, and help them to understand that God can help even the bad be for thy gain, for their benefit. Elder Dallin Oaks said this, "Whenever the outcome, and no matter how difficult your experiences, you have the promise that you will not be denied the blessings of eternal family relationships if you love the Lord, keep his commandments, and just do the best you can." When young Jacob suffered afflictions and much sorrow because of the actions of other family members, Lehi assured him, "Thou knowest the greatness of God, and he shall consecrate thy afflictions for thy gain." Similarly, the Apostle Paul assured us that all things work together for good to them that love God. My advice when something bad happens to someone you love, a good person, they don't deserve it. Teach them that God can help them make the best of the situation and turn it for their good. Some of the doctrines now that Lehi will teach his son Jacob, a lot focuses around agency and how agency works. Because of the agency of Laman and Lemuel, certain things happens. So this little diagram, I think I've learned it like many years ago, but it really just effectively teaches about agency. There is a right and a wrong. When you choose right, it will lead to freedom. When you choose wrong, it will lead to captivity. Spiritual, sometimes physical. There are 4 things that must exist, Father Lehi teaches, for agency to work, to operate. A little acronym for that is the polka. P is the power to choose. You must have the power to choose in order for agency to have to work. There must be opposition. So a right and a wrong, a good or a bad. There must be law that overarches that determines the right and the wrong. And an individual must have knowledge in order for agency to be active. Or the polka. kind of a fun way to teach it, explain it, and remember about agency, how agency works. 2 Nephi chapter 2, I think we could spend hours on. But let me briefly teach you, or just remind you, some of the ways that 2 Nephi chapter 2 could also be explained. Okay, you have the first way through the lens of Jacob, why it was originally given, and what Lehi teaches about agency. You could also talk about the isms of the world. Now, these are 4 things, 4 isms, that Lehi identifies and then counters. He talks about existentialism, or, hey, we have no purpose but to exist. Hedonism. Really, we're here only for our personal comfort and our pleasure. Relativism, which is very popular in the world today. Everything is relative. Truth is relative. There's no law, therefore, and no absolute truth. And determinism. We're a product of our environment and genetics, therefore not responsible for our actions. Now, of course, genetics plays a part. Our environment plays a part of who we are. But Lehi is going to teach you can rise above the rudeness of your brothers. Through God's help, you can rise above that. So the way Lehi exposes those isms in 2 Nephi chapter 2, God does have a purpose. He teaches that. The purpose is our exaltation and our happiness. Happiness is a result of righteousness. We're not just there for our comfort. We're here to be righteous. There is a law. God gave a law. And righteousness is based upon being obedience to the law. He also says that we are agents unto ourselves. We are free to act for ourselves and not be acted upon. 2 additional ways you could study the 2 Nephi chapter 2. First, and this is kind of a flow, God is a being that acts and is not acted upon. His purpose is to make men like him, gods. In order to be a god, men must act and not be acted upon. This necessitates agency, law, and opposition. The fall brought about such a work, so the agency can happen. Man is now free to choose, and the atonement overcomes the fall. A second way to teach kind of the same doctrine that he's teaching is God's purpose is to make men happy. Happiness is when you're righteous. Righteousness is a part of being obedient to law, and obedience to law is valueless without agency and opposition. The fall brought about a world of opposition, and the same kind of man is free to choose, and the atonement overcomes the fall. I have found that 2 Nephi chapter 2 is a chapter you could read time and time again with different, I want to say, lenses, and be able to understand more of the doctrine and the gospel of Jesus Christ than ever before. It's a marvelous chapter. I hope you have a great time studying it. Let me add just a couple more things. 2 Nephi chapter 1, I blew past, but there's a couple phrases in chapter 1 that I love. Because in chapter 1, he talks about what a real man is. And so what I try and do with my classes is talk about, I'll ask the girls first, what's a real man to you? And I get some great answers. And then I'll write them up on the board and maybe talk about, okay, if God was here saying what's a real man, which ones would he emphasize? And then turn back to the scriptures, because here's what Father Lehi emphasizes a real man is. So in verse 21, he invites his sons to arise from the dust. And this is really a quote from Isaiah. Isaiah is always talking to them about rise from dust. Get that earthly element, the Babylon, off of you. Shake it off. Get up out of the dust and be men. Here's part of what being a man is. You need to be determined in one mind and in one heart. Have a commitment to righteousness. And be united in all things. In verse 23, you got to wake up, once again, that Isaiah theme of awake to God's purposes. Awake to where you are at and get going. Put on the armor of righteousness. Now, you could spend a lot of time on that. But God has the armor he's put there for you to put on. Shake off the chains which you are bound. Now, earlier in the chapter, he's talked about some of the chains. He talked about, oh, that you would awake from a deep sleep, even the sleep of hell, and shake off the awful chains which we are bound, which are the chains that bind the children of men, that are carried away captive out of the eternal gulf of misery and woe. Now, that in verse 13 are some of the chains. You got to wake up out of those chains of hell. And it's interesting to kind of ask, okay, what are the chains that are holding us back today? And Lehi says, you got these chains. You're going to have to choose. You're going to take those off. You're going to be encircled with chains, or are you going to be encircled with the arms of God's love? Great comparison. Good habits are the soul's muscles. The more you use them, the stronger they grow. Bad habits, first we could break them if we would. Then we break them if we could. Habits are chains that are too small to be felt until they're too strong to be broken. And then when they're too strong to be broken, sometimes we get too accustomed to having them on. Shake off the chains that hold you bound. Another thing that men do is you come forth out of obscurity. Be a light to others. Be an example to others. Don't wallow in the obscurity of the world. Rebel no more against your brother, the prophet. Don't rebel against prophets, because he's been an instrument in the hands of God. And in verse 25, prophets like that, like Nephi, don't want power or authority over you. They only want the glory of God. So real men, just generalizing, don't seek for power and authority over others. They seek the welfare of others. They seek the glory of God. Real men speak with plainness. They speak the truth. They speak boldly. They speak the words of God. But I'd also add kindly. They have the Spirit in them when they speak. Real men have the Spirit of the Lord. Real men hearken to the words of the prophet. Bishop Edgley said that a true man is strong enough to withstand the wiles of Satan, and a true man is humble enough to submit himself to the redemptive powers of the Savior. In one way, as I studied the New Testament, I think Pilate was right. When Pilate introduced Christ, he said the words, "Behold, the man." Christ was the real man, the true man. If you want to be a manly man, the more manly you are, the more Christ-like you are. Another thing you could talk with students about, and this is really good, I think, in working with teenagers or in your family or in a classroom. Zoram is described as being a true friend in verse 30. You could then turn to the class and just, define what a true friend is, with an invitation to be a true friend today. Now, I have a lot more things that we could talk about today, but I'm just going to summarize a lot of things. There are 12 prophecies about the prophet Joseph Smith in 2 Nephi chapter 3. You could identify them and talk to your family or class that Joseph Smith was designed and appointed to be able to be the prophet of this dispensation. Brigham Young said it was decreed in the councils of eternity long before the foundations of the earth were laid that he, Joseph Smith, should be the man in the last dispensation of this world to bring forth the word of God to the people and receive the fullness of the keys and priesthood and power of the priesthood of the Son of God. The Lord had his eyes upon him and upon his father and upon his father's father and upon their progenitors clear back to Adam. He has watched that family and that blood as circulated from its foundation to the birth of that man. He was foreordained in eternity to preside over this last dispensation. There's also prophecies about the Book of Mormon in chapter 3, verse 12. You also can cover Nephi's psalm and compare it to some of the psalms and his struggles, because he's very raw. You could make a comparison between the happiness of the Nephites, where they are, and what happens to the Lamanites as they split. But I want to end with 2 Nephi chapter 5, verse 27. In there, it describes that they lived after the manner of happiness. I love that phrase. Happiness, and I love the quote, is not a state to arrive at, but a manner of traveling. Certain unchanging principles and truths bring happiness to our lives. This subject has been interest to me for many years because although I'm richly blessed and have every reason to be happy, I sometimes struggle and do not always have the natural inclination towards happiness and a cheerful disposition that some people seem to enjoy. For that reason, 7 years ago, a Book of Mormon passage caught my attention. Nephi established a society founded on gospel truths, and of that society he says it came to pass that we lived after the manner of happiness. This passage deeply impressed me. I wondered what the individual elements of a truly happy society and life might be, and I began to search Nephi's writings for clues. I invite you to conduct your personal search. It could be a lifelong and worthwhile pursuit. The same pattern and elements of daily life that enabled Nephi and his people to be happy 560 years before Christ work equally well today. Thanks for spending some time with me. Now, in order of the chapters, we talked about some ideas of defining. You could define a real man, real woman. What is a true friend? You could teach why do bad things happen to good people. What doctrine could you then teach someone who is having something bad happen to them? And what could you do today to live after the manner of happiness? Thank you for joining me for Brother Miller's Notes. I hope you have a lovely day. Bye-bye.